the Tuesday evening series, Architecture. The next lecture will be given by Farrell and Grimshaw on January 20th. Tonight we have James Gowan, who you probably are all well familiar with, inasmuch as he teaches here, and has been in and out of the A since about 1958. Just to give some vital statistics on him, in case you don't know, he was born in Glasgow in 1923, which makes him 52 years old and difficult to talk to. Scottish. He was taught at the Glasgow School of Art and Kingston School of Art here outside of London. He's worked with various architectural firms such as Lyons, Israel, and Ellis, where he teamed up with Jim Sterling. Together, you obviously know that he designed the Leicester Engineering Building. And he was in partnership with Jim Sterling until about 1964. Since then, he's been designing mostly private houses and small developments of houses. And his work, if I could characterize it, looks at first rather ordinary, but then it becomes tantalizing. The more you get to look at it, the more the complexities start revealing themselves. So I think James is going to be showing you his work in a rather ordinary and understated way, waiting for you to put together the pieces. James Gowan.
Charles James impressed on me that it would be necessary to introduce the illustrations rather than project a generalized picture of what one had done and talk about it. And this raised a very difficult predicament for me, because I haven't really an attitude towards architecture which can be summarized in a sentence or two, and the complications of unraveling what was in my mind have upset me for the last week or two, until at the last minute, since there was a sense of urgency about it, I've dashed off some notes, which gives you an insight into the way my mind works. It seems to work better at the last minute. When the fire is taking place, chemical things appear to happen which appear to me to sharpen my intelligence. If the sun's shining and there's no sense of urgency, nothing seems to happen. Now, I really want to paraphrase one or two points and make one general point, and then show you some illustrations. The first point is about simplification that I've just referred to. That it's clearly easier for an architect if his approach is simplistic. If you build in steel and glass and believe that that can project a future world for mankind, then the advantage of that is the narrowness of the vision. You haven't alternatives to upset you and disturb you at nights, and you can concentrate your attention on the development of that idea. In certain architects' hands, this can be reduced to a banality. In other words, taking steel and glass or any modern material is the Johnson crutch you can switch off thinking really, and that's, you know, stops the pain, and you can then just concentrate your attention on the development of that idea in a material sense. As I say, in most hands this degenerates into a banality, but on all propositions there are exceptions. In the case of Mies, one finds a very simple vision of steel and glass, very sophisticated vision, not acceptable in Europe, being transferred to Chicago, blossoming into, and taking part curiously in the Chicago, you know, fitting into the Chicago style. You find in the Mies simplicity that with each project a refinement appears, a great deal of surprise in his projects. You look at when the projects came out in the 50s, everyone thought that he had scraped the bottom of the barrel, and then the next project came out, and then the next, and each time he flicked the cards and introduced a refined development of the idea, which was really shattering to me, and still is. I think that the remarkable development of Mies is the contradiction in that point. In the simplification that occurs in theory is, if one takes, say, an example like Venturi, that one can criticize him on one hand, and on another level respect him. The simplicity of his idea that you can refer to the past and find in it a regeneration that is meaningful today results in his parents' house, where you have a fairly conventional house with classical details screwed onto it. You know, when one first saw that building in the, I forget when the photographs arrived in this country, but when the audience first saw this, a group of about 20 or 30 people first saw this in London in the, whenever it was, the 50s, 60s, thereabouts, they laughed. They just spontaneously laughed at it. You know, what one sees it differently now because one understands the meaning behind the man's actions. But at that time it was grotesque to screw dados onto the facades of houses. It was grotesque to introduce Palladian motifs. But one can see that he was making a reference to the past. He was trying to align modern architecture to the past, and not unexpectedly so, because the classical training via the Beaux-Arts has never really left America. It's something that we perhaps don't appreciate here, but America is steeped in Beaux-Arts tradition, and they made your teachers, you know, people like Labattu at Princeton, and one didn't realize that the French had exported such an idea. But even so, perhaps I oughtn't to develop the Beaux-Arts idea. The other point on simplification, if I just touch on, say, three of them, and their dangers or inherent weaknesses, is that the reassurance that they give you gives one a false sense of intellectual security. There is in modern architecture a number of mechanical analogies. If you extricate them from modern theory, you'll find they're rather akin to plumbing, i.e. the emphasis on, say, circulation. It is a plumbing notion, really, very much a plumbing notion, that one canalizes a material and pumps it in a particular direction, you know, and connects with it. The analogies in modern architecture with mechanics are very naive, really. The idea of architecture as connections, you know, just a series of connections. Of architecture as a series of components, of fabrication, of notions of standardization, that they all are in the same bag, and they all, if they have a meaning, have a limited meaning, and no more than that. If I could switch off really on the hazards of that, and perhaps this is an indirect defense of my circumlocution. The other hesitancy I have is to do with post-rationalization. The architects and myself, you know, fall into this trap so often that we divorce the rationalization of what we have done with the angst of the reality, i.e. one moves into an architectural problem rather nakedly and hesitantly, and at the end of the episode, if it's successful, one confidently and reassuringly writes about the events. Time and time again, these rationalizations, if you put them to the test, you'll find to be immensely suspect. You'll find in Britain particularly that historians are sort of sucker for these post-rationalizations, that they curiously are prepared to overlook everything about a building and read the script and then talk about it. And this is charming, really, but it undermines their strength as critics, that they should be so naive as to read the small print. Clearly it's something that architects know about. Architects know about the difficulties of drainage and site matters and clients bellowing down the phone. They know about these, and they know that they inject a sense of urgency into the whole operation, which curiously is edited out of the fables that are wrought afterwards. Now, if I could give one example, kind of boring one, but how this works. In the case of the Preston Housing, which I'm not showing you tonight, I don't particularly like it really. When Sterling and I had finished the scheme, and really we finished the scheme having been kicked around by most everybody, you know, it really was a very painful experience. But when we finished the scheme, if I could not distinguish between him and I, the partner A wrote a piece of blurb for publication with the drawings, which were all done after the event as well. You know, they were nice, clean drawings, really. And they were just served up for the press. So partner A wrote a piece of blurb, and he passed it to partner B to hammer around or work on, as we tended to do. We tended to just to ricochet the thing to and fro, drawing a little bit of blood each time, and until one of us lay down through exhaustion. It was a simple, simple working relationship. But when partner B read the Preston blurb, he was horrified, really. was preceded by a quotation from Charlie Chaplin, of all people, who was being revived in a voguish fashion by the press. So he was very much up to the minute, Charlie Chaplin. And Charlie Chaplin apparently had written a piece which Partner B didn't know about. Holding forth on the beauty of slums and how that's where real life really happened, you know. That's where the good life, the simple things, the real life happened. You know, curiously writing this sort of thing in palatial conditions in Switzerland, I would have thought Partner B thought I'm cleverer than you think, actually. Yeah. Undermined the proposition. Anyway, the piece went on to relate the good things about the slums and to talk about telly and dustbins and that sort of thing, and sinks. They were voguish at the time, Royal Court, you know. And so a sort of contest happened about this piece. A thought it was bang on, really. It was going to serve up Preston very well, and B was embarrassed by it. So as a rather unusually, because we normally sorted things out, as I say, through exhaustion, but rather unusually in this case, we decided that since we couldn't meet on this piece of blurb, we would pass it to one person of the press that we regarded as rather highly, and that was Diana Rowntree. She had written many pieces in The Guardian on architecture, and they were beautifully written, and they were the best of their kind for a very long time. So we gave the piece to her and a photograph, and we met her for lunch, and she was so excited about the blurb. She thought it was marvelous, absolutely marvelous. I remember her saying, why don't other architects do this? You know, it's, you know, to have it all here, to know what's in your mind. And she wrote a piece. We had to agree by that it must be good. And she wrote a piece, and so the slum theme promoted itself on Leicester. And it is really to do with, this is on the point really, it is a criticism of facile summaries in retrospectively. And it's a criticism of the meaning of them, and it's a criticism of whether they should have any intellectual consequence. If I could just switch to the historian thing and the written word. We have touched on their preference for it. It's clearly easier, and one mustn't be mustn't be overcritical about this, and it is simpler if one is dealing with, say, Corbusier, to take his written work and compare what he does with what he said. It's a good formula, and it has a certain meaning. It isn't. We tend to assume, say in the case of Banham's book on the the theory of modern architecture, we tend to assume that the book is comprehensive, but of course is comprehensive only if one wishes to read a book on architects who've written about modern architecture. It's a curious selection. You obviously can write a book on red-haired architects, you know, and that there are other subdivisions which could be more amusing. But it isn't true that in the historical critical world that this is normal. It isn't true that one has got to stand alongside one's buildings with words, that is normality. It is reasonable to be aligned with them silently. In the case of Pevsner, one can criticize him very much as a historian. One can criticize the fact that he looks upon architectural style as details, and one moves from one style to the next comparing the details. A previous style has pointed windows, the next style drops the pointed windows. It goes on like that. It appears to be a preoccupation with details. But on the other hand, the man is using his eyes, you know, similar it might be. He is using his eyes acutely, and that's clearly an important part of it. He props it all up with a factual background as well, which one wouldn't otherwise have. In the case of a historian like Wittkower, another level comes into the writing which I greatly admire, and I would like to stress, and it is this, that Wittkower doesn't read the architect's blurb, which in classical terms it does exist. He doesn't just read the blurb. He appears to approach the building in an archaeological sense, as if he was discovering the thing for the first time. And therefore, if you look at his book on the principles, architectural principles in the age of humanism, one finds not this relationship that I've been talking about, but at investigation into villa types, comparative studies of them, the unloading of his musical themes, and the investigation of the proportional systems as a piece of detective work. It is curiously different. If one looks at a Wittkower essay on, if one's going to think of his most sort of myopic one, the comparison of classical balustrades, he just stands the balustrades, some 20 of them, up on a line, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, just on a line, and talks right through them. You know, the concentration of attention on the actual article, you know, the artifact itself, and the scrupulous comparison. He divorces himself really from the architect. He is using, it's an intelligence, it's a brain looking at the things afresh and finding relationships. I would imagine it been extremely difficult to have conned Wittkower with the Preston blurb, you know. In the case of, to break off this theme really, in the case of an architect like Aalto, one finds that since he hasn't really written very coherently about his work, and yet is probably the best modern architect that we've got, it's arguably so, one finds surprisingly that he doesn't have the same prominence in the bookish world because of that. But in the but to architects, of course, they make another compensation internally for that. I think I'm taking too long about this, really. I think I'll skate through this fairly quickly, if I may. This was an anecdote about the AA when I was teaching in third year, rather long time ago. People in the unit were guys like Stuart Beattie and George Kassaboff. There was about 20 of them, all like that. You know, it was absolutely intimidating. Richard Rogers was one, just 20 like this, you know, all about 6 foot tall and so big. and one day they cornered me. I sort of taught them by tearing up their schemes and saying they're not worth talking about, you know. And in the end, they sort of I got so rather frightened about it. But I remember on one occasion when they crowded in on me, and they demanded from me. At that time there was a very unclear idea of what architecture was about, kind of like now, and they demanded of me an explanation of what architecture was directed at. And I had no idea, you know, absolutely no idea. But I had to eat, and I knew it was expected of me, and in desperation I said, it's to do with the search for truth. And we were all terribly embarrassed, you know. I was, you know, they all hung their heads, you know. And because it had this sort of evangelical ring about it, you know, it was it was sounded pretty self-righteous and Christian, but curiously, it's rather near the mark, you know. that one, you know, one mustn't apologize. You mustn't apologize for being young. You know, it's something one can't help. You know, you've got to live with it, and so these things come out. But time is not your right, and it really wouldn't, if pressed, it wouldn't greatly differ from my interpretation of what architecture is about now, because I do think, having had it demanded of me, that architecture is the dialectic between classical and modern architecture, the dialectic between classical and modern architecture, the dialectic between the rational and the subjective. I think it's a stress, you know, between these two polarities. In the background to what one is doing is an immense classical tradition, and in one's mind is the tenseness of the dialectic between modern theory and that, the continual attempt to relate the two and make them have some meaning. This is somewhat different to regarding architecture as an episode in the history of man that was unique, when everything was thrown out the door, and that everything that a modern architecture did was a marvelous invention, the principles of which he established himself and for which he had not to account to anyone else. He was a very great man indeed. We of course are left with the conclusions of, you know, of such an attitude. Clearly, if you think you're free from these inhibitions and free from all the rules, you can be extremely lax about all the principles which held architecture up previously. They're kind of stupid as well. The dialectic between the rational and the subjective is the important thing that I would add to that, and that is that we are presented, say, take one example in modern architecture, with a program, a research, or the like. And this, in a sense, represents the objectivity in the problem. And we have to relate that to a whole series of subjective and dissimilar parameters which don't connect. You've got to relate cost with beauty, and circulation with clients' preferences. You've got to relate your own weaknesses to an immense problem. So I would regard this as an important second stream to the dialectic. Now, having touched on a definition, I'll summarize one or two points. In Palladian architecture, which could we, for the sake of the discussion, for Palladio, read, Vitruvius or Berti, Surly, or that sort of thing, In Palladio, that we have a concentrated summary of what a man in the 16th century, an architect in the 16th century, regarded as the parameters for the operation. And without labouring it, because usually one mentions classical architecture, Palladio, everyone starts yawning, But without labouring it terribly, if one cuts through the Quattro Libri, one will find an immense number of innovatory comments, and very succinct ones as well. There is a very direct proportional system which hasn't really been upset. An arithmetical and geometrical proportional system. Terribly direct because not because, but in some part due to the fact that the eye doesn't discriminate between tiny refinements, not quite like the ear. That the eye does recognize a square, it recognizes a rectangle, it recognizes a double cube. It recognizes direct proportions. It can even recognize 5 to 8, and Fibonacci series. But at a certain point, when the proportions become, say, 5.5 to 8, the eye loses that one. It can't pick it out. And the Palladian proportional systems were very direct and visually meaningful. They gave you a good room, and it was a 100% guarantee. It did mean that you didn't have to invent bad rooms for yourself in modern times. It saved you that trouble. The circulation, the plumbing term, isn't an unusual term either. That takes it back. That must be 4 centuries now, 4 centuries old. He stresses the idea that the haves should live on an elevated ground floor, and the have-nots should be underneath serving them, and that it's a terribly neat idea which is used again and again in modern architecture, that the service takes place underground and you pop up holding the trays and the goodies, for your betters. But this very neat, the separation of circulation from the working parts of the building is in Palladio as well. The Corbusian theme of sunlight and air is there too. There's a tremendous stress on the orientation of buildings, the ventilation, the advantageous position of rooms. There's a sense of innovation too, because the Palladio was taking archaeological Roman remains, and he wasn't really reviving them. He was creating another architecture out of the pieces. But curiously, there is also the technical innovation. If one thumbs through the thing closely enough, you'll find that he's got charming things like an internally ventilated lavatory. He's got an internal lavatory, and he's got vents running up through the middle of the building. In the 1500s, very daring. We've just introduced it into London housing now. And last item which I touch on is the hierarchical sense, that his book is subdivided into pieces, but he had in mind a society which esteemed church buildings very highly, and they were the best. They had to be recognized as being the finest. Public buildings second on the scale, because they served the common good. Third on the scale were the aristocracy. Next on the scale were the wealthy businessmen, but they had to be most careful not to usurp their position. They couldn't ride up the scale. Much like an English, parish town, you have to know your position architecturally. In a country town or a country village, you mustn't build better than the squire. So it's not such an old idea that he switched off, by the way, once one got on to the common man and that sort of thing, he switched off. But he did set down a hierarchical system. In modern architecture, if one takes Corbusier and as summarizing, as I think he does, the position of the modern architecture, I think he summarizes it in words, which is in contradiction to what I said before. I think he summarizes in words, and I think he summarizes it in deeds. He makes more mistakes than any architect the world has ever known, but he still achieves a very elevated position intellectually. If one considers the Samson attitude towards Corbusier, it was rather facile when he made it some 10 years ago. He said, and Samson is a man who can go from classical architecture to modern architecture kind of easily. He doesn't appear to see immense distinctions between the two, and he's right. When he was lecturing about Cobb during the period of the Cobb exhibition in the Building Centre, he said he's very easily explained that he just turns everything upside down. All the things that you and I regard normal, he merely inverts. And we thought this was absolutely dreadful. This man had the nerve, to talk about one's God in such a fashion. But of course, it is true. He quoted certain examples like the roof terrace, that you take the garden, which normally you screw to the ground, and Cobb puts it up on the roof. You take ramps, which are for driving cattle up, or large number of people, and he sticks them right in the middle of the house. You take mechanical contraptions like lavatory basins. Instead of putting them in private rooms, he sticks them in the entrance hall. Everything terribly daring, and such a shock, and that's the intention. The intention is something to do with surprise, but the thing that Cobb didn't escape from, and even at a sort of more profound level than the Samson remark, the thing that Cobb never escaped from was the sort of classical idea, the simple rectangular idea, moving into it and tearing it apart. In other words, the parameters that he was attacking in his buildings were classical parameters. He set up the classical parameters in a French fashion. He moved in as an artist and an intellectual and tore them apart. And his buildings are a demonstration, one can argue, of this, a manifestation of this dialectic. It doesn't have a great appeal to the English, because if you recall de Tocqueville, he insists that the English don't regard intellectual matters highly. You recall? No? No. The Georgian Terrace House, I can't imagine why I've got this down, but there we are. But it's on this classical traditional theme. I scotched through it. It's been with us a long time, and it is a London phenomenon, but it's worth recalling what it has to offer and make one point. One, it has had to offer longevity. The simplistic nature of its construction, the London brick, the stoutness of its floors, the standardization of its windows, and the anonymous nature of its planning have given it remarkable longevity. But it's not that it's not a crude building form, really, and this point again is aimed against modern architecture. If you even roughly scrutinize a Georgian terrace house, you'll see that the window to wall relationship, time as not, is 50-50, i.e. from reveal to reveal, from pier to pier, tends to be about equal. You know, you'll find that maybe this one is 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet. You'll find quite often 4 foot 6, 4 foot 6 pier, 4 foot 6 window, an equal thing. In a general sense, it doesn't mean that the walls are glazed 50%. It's obviously less than that. So you have a phenomenon, really, which has survived 2 centuries of a building glazed precisely to a certain extent, and yet capable of enormous adaptation. It's been used as architects' offices, it's even used as a school of architecture, you know. This is meant to be a place for living in. Immensely adaptable building type. And it would be foolish to think that the lighting of it was not discriminate. Now, the point I'm making is about the strip windows and the overglazing. It's the sort of point about the Alan Cahoon, John Miller glass house, you know, the country glass house that they built. So you build a glass house in the country, and then the next thing you do is you devise technical means for cutting out the glare and the heat loss and so on and so forth. You know, you make a proposition, and then you start back climbing to make it operative. You don't have to do this. The solution is succinct enough to survive. Okay, something that looks crude bears investigation. The traditional English house or cottage, I'm thinking of the 18th, 19th century rural cottage, is full of surprises as well. If one just doesn't look at it as a romantic image, a small cottage that we measured up recently had a floor plan 21 feet by 24 feet. The facade was a golden cut. The windows were 4 foot 6 high and 3 feet wide, and the recurring proportional dimension was 3 feet. And this is a naive little building in Berkshire. To think that the tradition in a rural sense is a farmer and an adst and a thick mind is one of the more arrogant assumptions that the modern architect has made. Curiously, these traditional houses have survived, have had enormous capability for survival, and it's something to do with the detailing. In particular, if one takes points like the eave overhangs and compares them to a modern building, modern buildings, as far as roofs are concerned, see everything as a cube on which you jam a roof. But if you look at a traditional building, one sees that the roof corbelling is twofold. One, it conjures up the classical image that's behind everything. And two, when the gutters fall down, as they always do, and rust and deteriorate, the water is shed off clear, and the building keeps going through years and years of neglect. To call such a building non-functional misconstructs the English language. on the subjective issues that I touched upon, I could summarize these quickly. Delabar Vasily, when I said to him, Delabar, I feel as if I'm ahead. I feel as if everything is happening in my head, and the rest is just hanging from it, you know. How do you feel? And he said, oh, no, I don't. Not at all. How disgraceful. No, not at all. He said, I feel as my whole being. I feel equally throughout myself. And this is clearly a distinction between he and I. I really do have a tenseness between here and here, which invokes more awareness than any other part of my body. The rest of my body feels all right, you know. But it just feels at an indeterminate temperature. There is a pain in my head all the time. Sometimes the pain is gentle, and sometimes it's unbearable. But it's not an unpleasant pain, actually. It's as if it's as if there was some remarkable mechanical operation taking place there, some remarkable mechanical device whirring quietly away. It isn't. I know that it operates electrically. I know that there's about 100,000 million nerve cells, and therefore it should be without feeling. It should be silent and without feeling. But that isn't how it comes over to me. It doesn't whir, but it's reassuring. Now clearly if Delabar and I go into a problem, we go in with a different point of view. He takes all of himself into it, and I apparently don't. But there again, there might be contradictions there. He might think he does, and I might have misconstrued. So, on the personal thing, an architect, as Smithson once said, sometimes he says sensible things. As he once said that you take your luggage with you. You know, architect takes his luggage with him. And this conjures up the idea of this medicine man going from one cowboy town to another, you know, with your wretched wares. But that's what you do. Wherever you go, you can be dropped on any part of the earth. You've got this tatty old luggage with you, that you're the same man. You can't get away from it. And these are to do with one's weaknesses and capabilities. And I would stress, or I would suggest to you, that you can't make a move of any consequence in architecture without an appraisal, a very critical appraisal of your capabilities. I'd make another point, and that would be that the further you moved into architecture, the more you would know about yourself, and that the reality that I have in my case, that I have to invoke an inherent laziness in order to get myself going. I've got to hang a bait in front of me. It's an intellectual bait in order to get out of bed. That is one realization of the sort of person I am, that I will never escape the Scottish Puritan tradition, which Maxwell reminded me again and again. Everyone reminds me of it. He reminded me again last night, you know, of course you're Scottish Puritan, and that's just to start the conversation, you know. I will never escape it, but the realization of what luggage one takes into the fray is an important part of any warrior's appraisal of a battle. But what fool really would go into a fray without, in an Ingmar Bergman fashion, polishing up his equipment, i.e. when you're Virgin Spring, if you're taking on 4 robbers, you've got to do a lot of polishing before they vend, you recall. The last point on the personal thing, it is worth mentioning, although it's kind of hazardous, it's the Eichmann thing. I think in a way the world has changed after the Eichmann trials, the Nazi trials. I think the idea that was assumed to be acceptable, that is, that if you're part of a large organization, that the person in it doesn't matter, the individual, the personal self doesn't matter, that the person is under instruction from another source. I think that has been inverted recently. I'm making the point that really everything is changing. It's not just the plastic toys and books that are changing in a trivial fashion. There are big things changing, really. And it is no longer so that an architect can say, I am working for such and such a borough council, but since I'm only a cog in the wheel, I turn out trash. It isn't so. The last point is about the architectural program and Duchamp, who's changed one's attitude to that, and indeed one's attitude towards architecture. The program, it isn't a biblical set of tablets delivered to the architect's door, which he turns into building form. The development of an architectural idea isn't necessarily the willful pursuance in a single-minded fashion of some very facile artistic notion that barely fits the commodity or the reality or the practicalities. The Duchamp introduced the idea that it is possible to operate as a creative person without this willfulness. It is possible to drop things on the table and let society respond to them. And it is possible that society will make the right choice and that they will make fair and reasonable interpretation of what you do. I know in many cases he hadn't the same Puritan intention as I have, but his intention was perhaps in a Dada fashion to mock what was taking place in many cases. But in fact, he could relax, promote what he had to do in an intelligent fashion, and accept the consequences without propping it up with words and allowing society to discriminate. And in recent years, there has been this material switch in the way I approach architecture. I did find when I was operating with partner A and partner B that we appeared to have in common the pursuit of a single idea, a single magical idea of overwhelming beauty, usually, which worked fairly well sometimes, and which would make everybody's eyes pop out. Well, that's a reasonable objective for two young architects, but it carried with it tremendous penalties, and that was that in the relationship with the client, dreadful things happened, really. If they had been photographed, they would make a bizarre film, really. When we sold, I suppose that is the word, the Brunswick Park primary school to the GLC committee, the committee didn't want the building. They thought it was horrible. They thought there was insufficient windows at low level for children. They hated the high level windows. They hated the subdivision of the main space. We dug our teeth. They were all ladies, really, and they weren't terribly, it wasn't really a fair match. The two of us were there, really. It was a terrifying sight. And every point they made, we just smashed down, really. And we made a piecemeal mess of them, really. And we left the committee room really more or less shouting "Yah, boo" at one another. It had got to that level, you know, and the same to you, you know, and closing the door. This is actually the reality. The fact was that the GLC never referred that assembly hall building to the headmistress. At that time, she wasn't even approached for her views. The woman hated the building and really worked against it ever since. Now there are a whole series of situations which even the great Leicester doesn't escape, where one finds that with a miraculous idea you have got to stand by it like a nursemaid from then on. Once the idea gels, any client who wants rather more storage space, an enlargement of one room is a fool, a barbarian, and he has to be silenced and dealt with. He's usually silenced by lies, really, which is, he says, "I'd like to hang my coat up there," and you say, "Well, a coat, the column won't carry it, you know." If it's something a little bit larger, it will completely disrupt the building program. One doesn't meet him on his own ground, actually. The implications of his tiny requests are thousands and thousands of pounds, which of course scares the ass off him. It's a kind of, it is a working relationship of a kind, and it's of a kind where you need a new client every time. There've got to be a lot of them, because they never come back. The client that has kept me alive over the last few years has been an industrial client, and we built him factories after factories, and then factories and factories, and we fight one another the whole time. But one recurring client, this is an adage you must all remember, one recurring client is better than 20 separate ones who may or may not come along. In the case of the program in recent years, to whistle to a stop, we've done one or two things which on the face of it would have seemed hair-raising to me years ago. On the Bembridge housing, we did some 10 layouts at the end. We sent them to the council and said, "Which one would you like?" They didn't reply. They didn't like any of them. But the surprising thing about it is that the effrontery of setting up an exchange with the town planning authority is remarkably successful. It totally disengages them, and from then on, in the British law system, they can hardly say they weren't approached with a whole series of ideas. There are curious payoffs from the choice thing. It's not really all one-sided. In the case of the Bembridge housing, we offered the client a range of options and asked him which one he'd like. We're prepared to ask him the colours he liked, and we'll paint the building these colours. You name it, we'll do it, you know. The only thing we ask is to be included in the scheme of things. In the case of the Essex housing, which we're doing now, and I'll show you 2 or 3 slides of that. There was two. It's an absolutely ordinary scheme, absolutely straightforward, ordinary scheme, with 2 things about it. It has some circular windows, and it has some roofs that go this way and that. Everything was fine. Challenge for district council. It's a kind of big scheme. They liked it fine. The circular windows they were worried about, the roofs they were worried about. If we could get these out, everything would be okay. Now, we spent 6 months with this, producing 6 perspectives of the options. The dreary, the less dreary, adding the things in, adding in a little bit more. We took it to a committee, we told them the odds, and they decided not to change it. They decided, given the choice, to leave it alone. The advantage of allowing the client to make the decision, and after all, if an architect of any skill at all, there are surely 6 options that you can do well. The advantage of allowing the client to make the decision is that you have his backing. In the case of the little St. David's house, which I'll show you, when we produced that very, very quickly, kind of close on the client's requirements. In fact, so close on the client's requirements, it looked as if we were just under instruction. It was rejected by town planning in Wales as being brutal, out of keeping with its surroundings, and generally ugly, which, you know, was all true. And we said to the client, well, look, let's drop it. It's going to be an appeal and that sort of thing. Let's drop it. And we produced him a novel building, a little profile of the Villa of Valmarana exactly fits the old people's flats at East Hanningfield. These are a batch of sketches which I'll play through rather quickly. There's a dozen of them. Bottom left is the AA School of a proposal for the AA School of Architecture in Queensgate. It's got a footnote which you may be able to read. What?
Who is the man?
Well, he's a commercial architect, really. And the footnote is, architecture is primarily a commercial and professional activity. The other studies are about the same thing. Alan Bevan-John was working on a human figure, and that was a sketch I did, you know, for propping up the adjoining blocks. And then you sort of cram the AA School of Architecture into the 2 ladies. This is a rather ironic comment on modern architecture, but it's based on the idea that everything in modern architecture has been invented. All the components are known, that there's no need to be clever about it. Stairs, windows, the lot are ready-made vocabulary, and clearly you can fold up your drawing boards and computerize the elements, and really by very, very simple graphics. And the graphics are on the left there, just a very simple grid there. You can describe the building on the bottom left with these notes at the bottom. The heights could be indicated thus: main plan form A1 stroke 10 for the height. So you can give the height and you can give the ordinate in the prefix. And you really can do the Duchamp thing. You can phone the whole building over the phone and not do a drawing, and it wouldn't be any worse than that one there. These are two models of useless structures. We did 2 or 3 studies based on useless ideas, and this was one of them, really. This is a completely pointless structure which went through various stages and produced that drawing, and that's where it finishes. It's a nice drawing. That's in 71 or something. I didn't have much to do at that time, really. This idea seemed even more useless than the other, and this was a matchstick idea. You know, you took 4 matchsticks and formed a square, and then you just set up child fashion a structure, and then you made a model of it. You found, of course, the thing could rotate. This totally useless structure could rotate, and you could build something like that, which is kind of ugly, really, and it's extremely springy. And that went through various stages, and that produced that block of flats, which is drawn on the diagonal, which is a really nice drawing out of something useless. I did 1 or 2 things. The Italians seem to like this more than the English, but I did 1 or 2 things on stuffed animals. That's in 71, and I found the most useful animal was the pig, because it had a capacious body, and you could cram a lot of, well, say, office space into it and get little windows on it. And its little short legs, you see, were grand for neat circulation. And then I had to find a piece of London that would take the legs, and the best gridded piece of architecture is Mayfair. So it meant that the pigs had to straddle the Mayfair blocks. And curiously, a harmless idea began to have a kind of venom about it. You know, you found that although the idea of putting up a stuffed animal seemed perfectly harmless, clearly some stuffed animals were obnoxious. You know, some were pleasant and some were unpleasant. The pig I discarded. The giraffe, I liked the idea of the giraffe and couldn't think of a suggestion until someone at the Architectural Review, I think it was Peter Davies, said a giraffe is just the thing for standing in deep water. So I put this giraffe in Greenwich Reach. And this is a series of about a dozen sketches which were planted on Westminster without being asked. And they had to do with the fact that architecture, particularly if you stand in Westminster and look round, it is static, dismal, ordinary. The Adelphi has been torn down. You know, anything that was good has been torn down, and you just look out on a sea of ordinariness. And I thought that clearly architecture is thought of in terms of that. It is what we are doing more exciting than that? Does it bear out better than that? But if one gets away from these analogies and thinks in terms of, say, H.G. Wells, where the intruders from outer space came and landed in the countryside, and the people stood round this saucer object. I forget the book. Do you remember the book? Anyway, the H.G. Wells novel. And the villagers came around and looked at this marvellous object. It did occur to me that architecture has completely lost this sense of wonder. You know, that no one ever stares at a building and thinks how out of this world the thing is. The building, if anything, they're stunned by its contortions and its elaborations, which is a totally different thing. And this was to try and find, unsuccessfully of course, but to try and find some form which, if it landed in Westminster, would conjure up a bit of excitement. The office block keeps appearing from time to time. That's the office block. It's a stuffed animal. I found that the pig became less objectionable when you translated it into a Brancusi, and it took on the look of art. Then it could be made of brass or gold. Why not gold, really? And burnish it, and have it straddling the Thames. So there it is, doing its thing. Lifts up the legs, covered with tiny little windows, perfectly functional, just needs a bit of skillful detailing. This is a structural version of the animal. It has a beam underneath it, a beam running between its two legs, and a raking lift, which is very daring. And when the two useless buildings come together on a page, they come like that. The useless office block, the useless block of flats, and the useless stuffed animal. They come to like that on a page. And that's where they finish. And the last sketch is a tiny little thumb sketch, which is that of all the things I could think of, these outrageous shapes, they became more and more outrageous, these sort of, and they were all like aeroplanes, you know, sort of versions of Concorde and the like. Architects, you know, keep creeping back to the sciences for their ideas, which is a tragedy. And it occurred to me really that the forms I were using were becoming just more extreme and more eccentric. And this sketch of the massive figure straddling the Thames seemed to me to be the most exciting image of the lot, and it perhaps even in a joking form serves to remind one that architecture and the movies at their best are to do with the human condition. Thank you very much.
Further questions? I'll let people who want to leave and have some dinner leave. Questions in a few minutes.
Very nice. I wish you'd spend more time on the end.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, the beginning.
You had to rush.